All right, chapter 4, Gospels in the Making. The four Gospels on which we must largely depend for information about Jesus were the products of historical circumstances, which to an appreciable extent are ascertainable. On the showing of many Christian scholars who have devoted themselves to the study of these documents, there was no special inspiration either in their origin or composition. They are dramatizations with policy features, and what inspired them was the needs and conditions of particular communities of Christians in different lands. The Gospels belong to the period following the Jewish war with Rome and can approximately be dated between AD 75 and 115. Each Gospel bears the stamp of an individual author who treats the material at his command in his own way, but all the authors are writing outside Palestine in a substantially Gentile Christian environment. None of the Gospels is original in the sense that it is a first-hand authority, though we have to take account of the use of first-hand recollections and of primary documents no longer extant. The measure of faithfulness to such sources is important, and what we can glean of their character and worth, but also we cannot ignore that in the interests of theological doctrine, contemporary circumstances, and effective storytelling, nothing wrong was seen in creating views for Jesus to express, altering the sense of traditional sayings of his, supplying the coloring episodes with the help of non-Christian literature. The character of the Gospels is biographical, making allowance for the fact that they are controlled by an established design to represent the experience of Jesus in terms of a faith, originally a purely messianic faith. The authors are endeavoring to tell a connected story of Jesus. They are not very successful because their resources were slender and offered few indications of time and sequence. They were not in the position of a Plutarch, whose Lives of Great Men was composed early in the 2nd century, or of a Suetonius, whose Lives of the Caesars was written a few years later. But in making the attempt at all, they have conveyed to us that they were catering for circles influenced by Greek and Roman literary art, rather than Jewish, and also that confidence in the imminent return of Jesus was beginning to wane. As regards the latter, the sense of postponement is least present in Mark, one of the pointers to its relatively early date. While all the evangelists are aware how the public activities of Jesus began and how they ended, they are not at all sure how long they continued, what teaching of Jesus was related to what events, and what was the order of these events. In the Synoptic Gospels, most of the teaching of Jesus is found in Matthew and Luke. A good deal of it comes from some written source used by them both, and that source must have concerned itself little with time and place, since Matthew and Luke felt free to make their own decisions as to where to fit the material into the structure of Mark. But building on Mark, they were trying to achieve a biological result, finding themselves in the dilemma that while the career of Jesus had a definite beginning and end, it had no organized middle. We shall have more to say later about the lost teaching document. The determination of its existence has been one of the most important results of the literary examination of the Gospels. We may observe, however, that this document appears to have been unknown to the author of Mark and equally the source material for the nativity stories. This suggests that exciting fresh information became available after Mark was written or was in circulation in other areas than where this gospel was composed. When Mark was published, perhaps between AD 75 and 80, it was unique in Christian literature, for Matthew and Luke had no alternative but to use Mark as a guide. It is evident that they could not turn for assistance to any similar composition. When Luke speaks of many in his foreword, it has been held to mean that a number of others had written Gospels before he decided to undertake his. But in that case, it is likely that there would be evidence in his work that he was familiar with some of them and borrowed from them, and there is no indication of this. Luke's reference has a certain rhetorical quality, but he could be alluding to various collections of gospel stuff, applying Old Testament prophecies to circumstances in the life of Jesus, conforming to the more or less stereotyped pattern or outline of early Nazarene testimony. Long before the canonical Gospels, Paul shows his acquaintance with such testimony, especially in the connection with the final events in the life of Jesus. Though he was concerned with the Messiah in heaven rather than with his earthly career, except as its climax reinforced his message, he did know something about it, including that Jesus was of the line of David. He also felt it needful to check with the Nazarene leaders, lest by any means I should run or had run in vain. We have pointed out above, page 93F, that the very word gospel in Christian usage had a messianic significance, and prophetic testimonies applied to Jesus, when written down, would be just as much the gospel as the oral message, combining the Old Testament text with their fulfillment. Multiplying such collections with certain differences of detail from oral tradition would create what could be called gospels. We know what store was set by the prophetic gnosis in the early church and how much it was relied upon as the certification of our common salvation, the faith once and for all delivered to the saints. While Mark broke fresh ground in giving the proclamation of Jesus a more biographical treatment, he framed it on the testimony tradition. In his record of events, he does not bring out the fulfillments of the Old Testament as Matthew and John do, but the language he employs shows that he is well aware of them. He does not hesitate to begin his book with such prophetic testimony, and to say that Jesus regarded the experiences of John the Baptist and himself as being demanded by the Scriptures. That Mark's gospel owes much to the Nazarene prophetic gnosis is further indicated by the amount of space devoted to the narrative of Passion Week, rather more than a third of the whole book. It was the fate of Jesus, if he was the Messiah, which chiefly called for evidence that it had been foretold. The circumstances had therefore to be set out in much greater detail, backed by an impressive array of testimonies. Once Mark became well known, and after a decent interval as the unchallenged authority, it was to be expected that other gospels of this type would come into existence, at first based on Mark, but subsequently becoming more venturesome. Such a medium lent itself admirably to investigating various doctrines with the highest endorsement, and from about the middle of the 2nd century onward, a number of these uncanonical gospels appeared under the names of different apostles. In the early essays, the meat of the testimony gospel was in them, but the more vivid narrative presentation of these memoir gospels made them much more acceptable to the Gentile church. It is interesting to note that when Justin Martyr in the middle of the 2nd century speaks on the records of the life of Jesus read in the churches, he refers to them as memoirs or recollections of the apostles and those who followed them. The essentially testimony documents ceased to appear for the internal use by churches for whom the messiahship of Jesus was no longer paramount, and they would tend very quickly to disappear. Yet what they had represented could still be employed externally for controversial and missionary purposes in the form of testimonies against the Jews. To learn more of how the message about Jesus as Messiah came to be put into writing, we have to turn to early Nazarene history in Palestine. The period from AD 40 to 50 was one of dramatic events and intense religious and political excitement for the Jewish people. First, there was the attempt of the Emperor Gaius Caligula to have his statue set upon the temple as an object of worship. Such a blasphemous design had had no equal since the Seleucid king Antiochus Epiphanes in the 2nd century BC, had converted the temple into a shrine of Zeus Olympus, which united the nation in arms under the leadership of the Maccabees. The intention of Gaius similarly roused the Jews to resistance, and some took up arms. Most, however, awaited the outcome of massive protests to Petronius, the Roman legate of Syria. A full-scale revolt was averted only by the concern and delaying tactics of this official, who at personal risk made clear to the emperor what the consequences would be. Gaius grudgingly gave way, yielding to the persuasions of his friend, the Jewish prince Agrippa. But he ordered Petronius to commit suicide for disobedience, a fate which the legate escaped only because news reached him first that Gaius had been assassinated. Jewish nationalists and fanatics seized upon the situation and exploited it. All who were messianically minded saw in what had happened a great sign of the times, including the Nazarenes, to whom it must have seemed to portend the near return of Jesus. Partial calm was restored when the new emperor Claudius made Agrippa king of Judah, but it was necessary for the king to try to curb the hotheads. He executed one of the tempestuous brothers, James, the son of Zebedee. Peter was arrested and placed under close guard, but his escape was contrived, and he went into hiding, the wretched guards being put to death on the king's orders. The state of affairs was evidently more explosive than is represented in the Acts. Agrippa's sudden death in AD 44 brought Judah again under direct Roman rule and stimulated the spirit of revolt. Cuspius Fadus, sent as governor, had to take military action against the disaffected and the religious enthusiasts lumped together as rebels. On the orders of the emperor, he commanded that the robes in which the high priest officiated in the temple should be returned to the custody of the Roman garrison in Fort Antonia and handed out on each festal occasion. This measure, as Josephus reports, was thought so likely to provoke a hostile outbreak that Cassius Longinus, then legate of Syria, of Syria, arrived in Jerusalem and had brought a great army with him out of fear that the injunctions of Thaddeus would force the Jews to rebel. Later, Claudius dispatched a pro-Roman Jew, Tiberius Alexander, to assist in the pacification of the country. Among those killed at this time was the prophet Thaddeus, and James and Simon, sons of the former resistance leader Judas of Galilee, were crucified. In the story of this period, the old Russian text of Josephus adds a passage which, if it is not genuine, is not far off the mark. And since in the time of those governors, many followers of the wonder worker, i.e. Jesus, aforementioned, had appeared and spoken to the people of their master, that he was alive, although he had been dead, and he will free you from your bondage. Many of the multitude hearkened to their preaching and took heed to their injunctions. But when these noble governors saw the falling away of the people, they determined, together with the scribes, to seize them, for fear lest the little might not be little if it ended in the great. They sent them away, some to Caesar, others to Antioch to be tried, others they banished to distant lands. With this we may compare the words of Tacitus, that by the execution of Christ, the sect of which he was the founder received a blow, which for a time checked the growth of a dangerous superstition. But it broke out again and spread with increased vigor, not only in Judah, the soil that gave it birth, but even in the city of Rome, the common sewer into which everything infamous and abominable flows like a torrent from the quarters of the world. Historically, we are required to look at Christian beginnings without the rose-tinted spectacles of piety. The movement was largely composed of zealots for the law and was involved in the Jewish struggle for freedom. We have previously taken some notes on this and the measures of the Emperor Claudius to the counter-messianic propaganda in Rome and Alexandria. The pacification of Judah at this time must be seen as a prime cause of spreading this propaganda to the provinces and in Rome itself, partly by prominent individuals being forced to leave the country and partly by the deliberate sending out of agents and apostles. There is an early Christian tradition referred to by Apollonius and in the preaching of Peter that Jesus told his disciples not to leave Jerusalem for 12 years and then to go out into the world. 12 years after the latest possible date for the crucifixion would coincide with the repressive measures of Thaddeus and Alexander. It is pertinent that the Acts assigns to this period after the death of King Agrippa the first missionary journey of Paul and Barnabas, and laconically states that the word of God grew and multiplied. But Eusebius, following ancient tradition, says that the rest of the apostles who were harassed in innumerable ways with a view to destroy them and driven from the land of Judah had gone forth to proclaim the gospel to all nations. We are now better able to comprehend the circumstances which brought about the putting into operation of what has been called the Great Commission. It was this step which required the setting down of the prophetic testimonies to Jesus as the Messiah for the service of the evangelists. Since only the Hebrew text of the Bible was regarded as authoritative by the zealots, we must hold that the document in the first instance was written in the sacred tongue, not in Aramaic, the spoken language, or in Greek, and we cannot be far wrong in assigning the date of the testimony book to about AD 50. It would have been a short scroll, inexpensive to copy and easy to carry. There is strong evidence that the compiler of this little work was the Apostle Matthew. The Church Fathers all agree that he published his gospel in Hebrew, but canonical Matthew was certainly composed in Greek, and the mistake could have arisen from not understanding that Matthew's gospel was in fact the testimony book, which in the original sense was the gospel. The earliest reference, which offers some confirmation and may have misled later writers, is that of Papias, A.D. 144, who stated in a work of his now lost that Matthew compiled the oracles in the Hebrew language, and each interpreted them as he was able. The oracles means passages of the Old Testament employed prophetically as in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in this case in relation to Jesus as Messiah. Just as in the synagogue texts from the readings of the law and the prophets were translated by preachers and their application expounded, so was it the function of the evangelists to interpret and explain the oracles fulfilled in Jesus. Later, in all probability, testimony gospels would come into existence in Aramaic and Greek, the many of Luke's forward, in which the texts and applications were set down together, with variations according to the information available to each evangelist. We may take an illustration from Justin, who brings forward Genesis 49:2, binding his foal to the vine, and his ass's colt to the choice vine. He then tells us that this signified what was to happen to Christ, for the foal of an ass stood tethered to a vine at the entrance of a village, and he ordered his acquaintances to bring it to him. And he mounted and sat on it and entered Jerusalem. Our present Gospels say nothing about a vine at Bethany. Further evidence that the apostles who went forth from Judea in the reign of Claudius were equipped with a testimony book prepared by Matthew comes to us from other sources. Hold on. The Acts of Barnabas, though late and rather legendary, tells how Barnabas, when going to Cyprus, took with him documents he had received from Matthew, a book of the Word of God, and a narrative of miracles and doctrines. In the synagogue of Salamis, Barnabas, having unrolled the gospel which he had received from Matthew, his fellow laborer, began to teach the Jews. The sequel tells how on the martyrdom of Barnabas, the manuscripts were put away secretly in a cave with his remains. The reference to the second document, a narrative of miracles and doctrines, may relate to the teaching document, the second source used by Matthew and Luke, known to modern scholars as Q. Dang, got another one? How far does this go? I'm almost, wait a minute. Sorry. All right, I wanted to see. Oh, yeah. Of which let me start that last sentence over because I got confused. Matthew and Luke, known as to modern scholars as Q, of which Kirchhoff Lake was written. It is probably not too much to say that every year after AD 50 is increasingly improbable for the production of Q.